dreamt for so long.
Witness tarnished. A lowly tarnished. Tarnished warrior. A man cannot kill a god. Foul tarnished.
Don't worry, Torrent. Fortune is on her side.
Hey guys, Thingfishy here. So make your character, choose the Bandit starting class, and grab a golden seed as the starting item. Welcome to build guide number 14. And to round off my first year on YouTube, I decided to make a full guide on the build that started my channel. The one that I used for my second playthrough of Elden Ring, learned all of the bosses on, and made all of my original boss and parry guides on. My parry build. So unlike any of my other guides, for every parryable boss in this run, there is a full in-depth tutorial on how to do the fight on this build. Only since I know a lot more about the game now, and I made most of these guides on deliberately low levels, you'll be a lot more powerful than I was in those videos. I'll also be talking about any strategies that I missed back then, and some better ones for certain things that I've found since. This isn't a build like others in this series, where we'll be absolutely melting bosses with insane damage. This is a run to try if you want to up your game and get better at fighting the bosses. I found my first playthrough of Elden Ring so tough that I never thought I'd be able to beat it without summons, but getting through the game on this build taught me that I could. Now you've probably noticed that I'm not heading to Weeping Peninsula to start my standard setup route. And that's because in my mind, there's only one way to start a parry build. Margit remains the one boss in Elden Ring that I never made an in-depth parry guide for. And the reason for that is he's probably the easiest boss to parry, and will teach you an awful lot about Elden Ring's parry timings if you figure him out for yourself. If you don't usually use parrying in Souls games or haven't relied on it too much in Elden Ring, I'd highly recommend using Margit as your training dummy. Every single attack he does with the stick is parryable, even the ones that don't look it. Now of course fighting him straight out of the gate is completely optional, but he's one of my favourite bosses in the game, and every time I've seen him in the last 14 weeks, I've killed him in 10 seconds with a +6 weapon. So I wanted to have a proper scrap with him again. With any dagger, you can actually get 3 R1s in between the parries if your timing is perfect. However, 2 is completely safe and what I would recommend. These are the levels to get if you do want to do an early Margit, but if you don't, you can start off as usual by following my standard setup guide. Link to the full video and play along in the description. And unfortunately, you've got to do all of it, as we're going to be using both somber and smithing weapons on this run. Now while I was back in my inquisitive parry mood, I did discover something about the Onyx Lord in the sealed tunnel. I always fight him on an unleveled character for a laugh when I'm doing a smithing stone run. And on this one, I worked out that not only can you parry the sword attacks, but you can also parry these bare-handed attacks, as well as that meteorite cast. Might be useful for fighting the Yeonix tunnel versions of these guys if you have to go there for something. So we pick up the action here, at Lena's Rise in Caelid. Wait until night, and jump onto the side of this bridge to bait the Knight's cavalry into yeeting himself off. Okay, hopefully my runes aren't on the side of the bridge. Brilliant. And relax. Now head back to the gate front in Limgrave and ride south and down into Argyll Lake and through the valley. Now this invader is usually pretty tough, but today we're doing a parry run and we have the buckler. Okay, I'll edit that out. Let's try again. Now I did have a later weapon here, as I'd already killed Margit, but if you haven't, you can just gank him with Yura, like we did on the Arcane build guide. It's relatively easy as long as you're not too greedy. Now head to Fort Fareth and apply bleed grease to your great knife. Kill Grail and pop a pickled Foulfoot as she dies. Head to Iji and level the Reduvia to +6. If you haven't killed Margit yet, head in with Radagon's Sword Seal equipped and the Dex tier in your Physic to completely bully him. Now head through Stormvale Castle, dodging all of the arrows perfectly. Through the plaza and light the lift side chamber grace. Then double back on yourself and head back through the enemies and into this room with the grafted scion. Then take the door on the right before the lift and use the stone sword key to unlock the armory. Run in and grab our other main weapon for this run, the Misericord. Walk back to the round table and pop the runes you have from the setup to buy the smithing stones you need to level this to +16. I did this earlier in the run with Grail's runes, so if you don't have the runes, you can do this after Godric. Speaking of which, now the main reason I love Dagger builds for learning bosses is how fast they are. You can really get a good idea of how big every opening in the fight is by counting how many R1s that you can get in. And because your attacks are so quick, you don't have to worry as much about being locked in an animation like you are with bigger weapons. So as long as you don't get super greedy, you can always have time to preempt your enemy's next attack. Godric is easy on this build. While the damage doesn't look like much at first, the Reduvia's DPS and the bleed procs make his health bar disappear quite quickly. Now to Rhea Lucaria for Red Wolf. Strategy wise, this is very similar to every other build. Give him plenty of space for the majority of his attacks, but make sure you capitalise on those attacks with slow cooldowns, like the jump attack. Punishing a single jump attack is enough to do about a third of his health. Grab the stone sword key in the courtyard and head up to give the Carian parry god a taste of his own medicine. and you might imagine that Renala might be a little bit more of an issue than normal with this build, but happily not. We can one cycle her in phase 1, drinking our physic as she dies. Then for phase 2, the DPS that we're doing means that we only need about 3 decent openings to fully deplete her health. Now before we head to Volcano Manor, we need to grab some bits and bobs. First off, walk back to the Saints Bridge in Limgrave and up the hill and up this cliff to the right to get to the death-touched catacombs. Kill the Black Knife Assassin boss for the Assassin's Crimson Dagger talisman. This is one of the best talismans in the game for a parry build, and you'll see why later. Now walk to the highway junction in the Altus Plateau, and let's talk about infusions. There are dozens of different ways to set up a parry build with the Misericord in Elden Ring. For my playstyle, Bleed paired with a Dex Arcane hybrid build is a logical option, as I like to get stuck in between parries for a Sekiro style fight whenever I can. However, both lightning and fire infusions would yield more damage if you were going for a more passive style with the majority of your damage coming from ripostes alone. A bleed infusion also means that the bigger unparryable bosses like Plassey are a little easier to manage with a dagger. To get our infusion, kill this little scarab in the lake and put the Bloodblade Ash of War on your Misericord. Now head to Volcano Manor for Godskin Noble. And I don't really have anything to add to my original guide for this boss. The Crimson Dagger Talisman is a splendid addition though to all of these parry riposte fights, keeping our health topped up between parries. One thing that did happen in this fight though, is when he did his rolly thing in phase 2, I wasn't near any of the pillars. So I jumped behind this altar, and in a single moment realised that this is without doubt the easiest and most obvious solution to this attack. And I was so angry with myself for never thinking about doing this before. It's almost like it's there for this specific reason. Run through the dungeon to the Stone Sword Key Gate, then off the ledge and through to grab the Dagger Talisman, and all the way down to grab the Somber 7 by the Abductor. Now head to Altus and all the way to the Draconic Sentinel. For this one, get your parries in and hit him with R1s in his recovery. If you're not confident with the close range quicker parries, you can keep your distance and continually bait that jump attack, which is much more clearly telegraphed. Run through Lindell and grab the Avenue Balcony Grace. Now you can run back and bully the Avatar. Before we head into Godfrey, take a little detour and head up to the Colosseum to grab the Ritual Shield Talisman. Now for one of my favourite fights in the run. Fighting Godfrey with a dagger is so much fun. You can fit at least one R1 into every single gap, regardless of how tight it looks. So this fight becomes a dance of back-to-back dodges and attacks. It's ridiculously satisfying when you get it down. Now for Morgott. And Morgott is a very peculiar fight for me on a parry build. Without doubt, I think Morgott is the hardest boss to parry in Elden Ring. He's also the riskiest to parry, especially on lower health characters. As I said in my guide back in June, one of the factors here is how similar a lot of his attacks are to Margit's, but with completely different parry timings. I have worked out since that original guide that all of the dual wielding attacks are parryable, as is this upward swing, if you have lizard reflexes. A lot is said about Melania's quick 1-2, but this attack comes out so much faster. This might be the hardest attack to parry in the game. And my final discovery for this fight is that this blood attack that he does is kind of parryable. There's no animation for it, but if you get your parry timing right, you'll take no damage and you can get stuck in with attacks. And I did test this to make sure it wasn't just a wonky hitbox. Now head up to the mountaintops of the Giants, all the way to the Zamor ruins. Run through to this cellar to grab the Smithing Stone Bell 3. Then just as you're leaving the Zamor ruins, double back on yourself to hit this scarab out of the tree for a somber 7. Then over the bridge and kill the big scarab on the other side for a somber 8. Then up to light the freezing lake grace. From here, go wake this guy up from his nap and bait him into attacking this statue for some Smithing Stone 6s. Now ride through the rest of the mountaintops to the Grace by Fire Giant. Then run back and grab the ancient dragon Smithing Stone from this giant skull. Now up until now we've only had the Dex tier equipped to our physic, and it's time to put something useful in there. So head back to the Third Church of Marika in Limgrave, and up the Spirit Spring behind it, and around into Caelid to light the Rock View Balcony Grace. Now head towards the Minor Erd Tree for the Putrid Avatar. This guy's pretty dangerous, but he doesn't have a lot of health, so this won't be too much of an issue. If you get Scarlet Rotted, you can just open your map and warp out to a Grace straight after he dies. You'll get the tears when you load back in. Oh, that's right, if you do this you'll get the tears when you load back into the same area again. Oh. Grab the Green Burst tier and the Flame Shrouding tier. The Green Burst tier is a great option for this build, as that extra stamina recovery will mean that we can keep spamming attacks for bosses with bigger attack windows. Now we're going to walk back to Lanedale to the West Avenue Balcony Grace. Jump over this barrier and head down into the sewers. Light the underground roadside Grace across all of the pipes and down to the bottom. I'd recommend equipping the Ritual Shield Talisman here in case you take a 50 cal from the Lobster. Now head into the Lanedale Catacombs to get catastrophically lost for 20 minutes, thinking you're retracing your steps when you're actually not. Happily, although the dungeon is a little rough, the boss is relaxing, fair, and most of all, fun. Okay, so this is the only fight on this build where I went for the nuclear option. If you want to go for as much DPS as possible, you can dual wield both of your daggers for bleed procs. I have no advice for you on how to beat this guy, On this one, I killed the dogs and then fought him one-on-one, but it felt like more luck than judgment. On other builds, I've YOLO'd him with the dogs still alive. Go for whatever seems logical at the time. This fight is a nightmare. Now head to Caelid for Radahn, and you want to equip your shiny new Lord of Blood's Exaltation for this one. And this is actually one of the easier fights on the run because of our level. If you want to have a little bit more of a scrap with Radahn, feel free to come here earlier. After the fight, speak to Alexander. Go back to the round table and use the runes to level up your Misericord to +20. Now head back to the third church of Marika in Limgrave and ride south into the Mistwood, grabbing the spiked cracked tier by the minor Erd tree, and then southwest to the Mistwood ruins for the Axe Talisman. Equip these and head through Volcano Manor for Rykard. And first up, I owe some of you an apology. We usually fight Rykard with the Lance and the Serpent Hunter, using the crouching L1s, and I've seen a few comments recently saying it's patched. And when you have the Serpent Hunter equipped in your right hand, it is actually patched. However, swap it over to your left hand and the strat still works. I assume this came in on patch 1.08, but because I've always equipped the lance in my right hand, I've just never noticed. I've tried my best to get back to all of the comments that I responded to on this, but if I've missed yours and you've been struggling with it, apologies. None of these shenanigans today though, we're fighting him straight up. For a straight up Rykard fight, I like to go for charged R2s to take advantage of the Axe Talisman and the cracked tier. Most of the sword attacks can be countered with jumping R2s, I'm just too used to rolling them now unfortunately. For phase 2, be on the lookout for him raising his sword as the sky turns red. This is the start of that mental skull attack, and your weapon art can actually stun him out of this. If he does manage to get it off though, just run sideways. As much as the skulls are scary, make sure you're also keeping an eye on him, as you have to dodge this big slam attack at the end, as I'm pretty sure it'd be a one shot at this level. Now for Fire Giant, and I'd say that this is a pretty average Fire Giant fight. Phase 1 is a little longer than usual as our base damage sucks, but the bleed procs go a long way. And phase 2 is a little simpler than usual because of our bleed build. Use R1s on his hand and leg at the start of the fight, then stay in front of him and hit his arms for the rest of it. Now before we speak to Melina, we've got some bits to grab. First warp to the Altus Plateau and up to Mount Gelmir to speak to our best chum. Then walk back to the Celia Crystal Tunnel in Caelid and ride out into the Swamp of Aeonia for Commander O'Neill. Now, as I said in my original guide, the safe and sensible strategy here is to kill all of the summons before engaging O'Neill. But if that seems a bit too logical, feel free to run around like a madman like me and parry him whilst dodging all 10 of them. Take the needle to Gowrie for repair, then give it to Millicent. Now head back to Altus and all the way to the Shaded Castle. Up the ladder and then head left to grab the Valkyrie's prosthesis from this tower. Then give it to Millicent at the Erdtree Gazing Hill. Now head north across Altus to the Windmill Village for the Godskin Apostle. Phase 1 is actually the bit that you need to worry about here, as this guy isn't easy to parry. Phase 2 is easy enough with our bleed and DPS. Rest at the Grace, then speak to Millicent again. Then, wish her a very merry... Oh, this is so not Christmassy. Now we'll level up at the Grace. 7,000 runes for another level. What's an easy optional boss we can do for 7,000 runes? Okay, so I said ages ago that I'd fight that guy on this channel and I never did, so consider it done. He's an absolute nightmare though, so I won't use his runes, so you don't have to fight him unless you want to. Run through Farum all the way to the Dragon Temple Transept Grace. And this is usually where we head back to Limgrave and Liurnia for all of our sleep pot materials. But this is a parry build. My strategy for Godskin Duo has not changed at all since my guide. Ignore Skinny and parry Fae. I used the Reduvia for this fight as it was little more leveled up than the Misericord, but either will be great. As soon as they're dead, head back to Liurnia and ride north up the eastern coast to the Church of Vows to speak to the Big Pup. We don't need anything from him, but it's a good place to unwind after a Godskin Duo fight. Head back to the Round Table and buy all of the smithing stones necessary to level your Misericord to plus 25. The Draconic Sentinel on the bridge is much the same strat-wise as the earlier one, it's just a far longer fight. Something that I did notice with this build and my last one is that when you use a parry strategy and it's quite a long fight, he seems to get himself caught in this little attack loop. No idea if it's consistent, but I thought it was interesting. Now before we fight Malekith, head back to Volcano Manor and speak to Barnal in the drawing room. Then head back to Farum, turn left on the bridge to get to this little area where he'll invade you. You can get a cheeky backstab at the start if you time it right, then go for parries. Pick up and equip the Blasphemous Claw item and then head into Beast. Now, while I'm swapping talismans mid-fight like an idiot, this is probably a good time to talk about them, as we've got them all now. For any boss that can be riposted, go for the Dagger and Crimson Dagger talismans. For any boss that can't, go for Millicent's and the Lord of Bloods. The Ritual Shield is there too if you want some extra tankiness. Now, Beast Clergyman is actually quite easy on this build, as it's one of the only builds in the game where it's safe to fight him up close. If you want to be super safe, you can go with the traditional method of punishing with jump attacks. and the Malekith fight is actually pretty easy, and the Blasphemous Claw item almost trivialises it. One thing that I do need to remedy from my original guide on Malekith is how to deal with Destined Death. The method in my guide was actually unnecessarily complicated. The best way to deal with it is actually to just roll backwards if you're not right next to him, or rolling into his right side if you are. Even without Blasphemous Claw, you can kill him very quickly by punishing that 1-2 combo, but I wanted to finish with that immensely cool flying parry. Now for Gideon, and I know it's become a bit of a meme on this channel that I hate him and think he's the worst boss ever, and will go to extreme lengths to cheese him rather than fighting him, but after fighting him on my ultimate bonk build, he really wasn't that bad. And since it's the season of goodwill to all men, I decided to fight him straight up and see if we can put our differences aside. Nope, I still hate him. Genuinely, this fight took me longer than doing the whole of the late game. If you want to fight him straight up on this build, backstabs are by far the best option. But don't worry, there is also a cheese option that we'll get to later. Now for Godfrey, and this fight is epic with this build. But you do have to have your wits about you. R1s between every attack on Godfrey, as we did with the Shade version. For Hoarah, you have to be much more patient. Hoarah is probably still the boss I'm least confident with in Elden Ring, so if you're anything like me, you want to keep at full health with the Ritual Shield active so you don't get one shot by any of the grab attacks. Take your time and wait for a safe opportunity to get attacks in. The Stomp attack is by far the biggest one. Now head back to Farum for Plassey. And this is a really nice fight on this build. While the damage does look rough at first glance, because you can get attacks in pretty much constantly, that massive health bar will disappear a lot quicker than other builds. For extra DPS, feel free to go for dual wielding. You might also have noticed me swapping between the Misericord and the Reduvia on this run. And I don't really think there's much of a difference between the two for most fights. Reduvia has slightly higher base damage, but the Misericord procs bleed quicker and gives higher riposts. I found myself using the Misericord early on for bleed procs, then swapping to the Reduvia for that higher base damage halfway through fights when bleed is less effective. Now head to Castle Sol for Commander Nile. Stand over on the right side to bait the right summon for a parry, then either backstab or parry the other guy. For the commander, it's the same strat as always. For a safe strategy, keep your distance and parry the electric foot follow-up or the small tornado attack. Or just get stuck in and parry the standard attacks if you're more confident with them. Now head back to Caria Manor in Liurnia. Run through and bully Loretta. Light the Grace in Rani's Rise, and head southwest from there to drop down into this building and buy Carian Retaliation from Pidia. Nip back to the village of the Albinaurics in Liurnia to grab the second half of the secret medallion, then head to the Grand Lift of Rold. Ride through the snowfields all the way to Ordina town. From here, head southwest, now take the teleporter to Mogwyn's palace, to Mohg. Now, I never made a parry guide for Mohg, but this is a fight that can surprisingly be made an awful lot easier with parrying. You can use Carian Retaliation to parry all of his blood flame tosses, and the shower. You can see the results of this here. With a little luck with RNG, you can get him to half health without him being able to hit you once. This, when combined with the Purifying Tear from Eleonora, resulted in by far the most surprising and cool Mohg fight I've ever done in Elden Ring. Building up enough posture damage to break his 120 poise with a dagger, and staggering him somehow with a parry. Now it's time to head down underground, so back to Limgrave and down into the... Head through Nokron, light the Ancestral Woods Grace for later, then through the woods and into the Aqueduct for the gargoyles. And this is rough. Bleed won't help us here, but the biggest problem is our range. We need to be so close to them with either of our daggers that it makes it really hard to see what the other one is doing. Yeah, this isn't very fun. Happily though, after a ton of research, I found out about a very rare katana that might work well with this Arcane Dex build. I doubt any of you have heard of it before, but according to the wiki, you get it from an invader in the mountaintops. For anyone who didn't see that coming, this is your solution to the earlier Gideon problem. Grab a Somber 5 from the alley southwest of the Celia Crystal Tunnel. And while there is an easy Somber 6 in Mount Gelmir, I went back into the Aqueduct for some Crucible Knight parrying for a far more exciting option. If you want to use Corpse Piler, you can head back to Farum, through the Stonesword Key Gate and up to Alexander. Do some sparring with him, then take the shard that he hands you before he wanders back to the Church of Vows to chill with Miriel. Rivers of Blood makes the Gargs a lot easier due to its range. I ended up doing it with the Reduvia as I enjoy the suffering, but we will be using Rivers of Blood later, so do grab it. Now for Deeproot Depths and Fear's Champs. Not much to say about this one. Cheeky backstabs for the first two, R1 spam if you miss. Then for the trio, keep your distance and parry them one by one. Now back to Rani's Rise to speak to her and the lads. Then down into the Knight's Sacred Ground for the Fingerslayer Blade. Then speak to her again and use the teleporter in Renna's Rise to reach Angel River. Run through the Lake of Rot all the way to Astor. This is a really easy one. Spam R1s on the head and let the bleed do its thing. The light rolls make dodging all of the AoE stuff relatively simple. Now walk back to Liurnia and head east to the Carian Study Hall to place the inverted statue and head up all the way to the top for the Curse Mark of Death. Now head back to Deeproot Depths for Fortis Axe. And on this build, he's a lot harder than usual, as it's a much longer fight. Having said that, our attacks are quick enough to not worry too much about getting constantly interrupted by the lightning, unless you're too greedy. I just went for R1s on the foot. Now back to Ordner Town. And Ordner Skip still works, but since glitches are out for this run, here's how I like to do the Ordner Town puzzle. Head first to the tower on the right by the invisible Black Knife assassin. Then through and around to the ladder and up for the second one. For the archers, make sure you have the ritual shield equipped. Take a dozen attempts to do this very simple jump, and then use your light rolls to avoid the arrows. Backstab this archer. Light the third, then jump down for the final one. Run through the Halig tree all the way to Loretta. Nothing much to say about this, same strats we've used for all of the other tree sentinels. Run through the rest of Elfil, picking up the Ancient Somber for Rivers of Blood, and light the Grace at the Halig tree roots. Now for Radabeast. Radagon with the Misericord is a little tougher than usual, but not insanely difficult. However, doing a tough Radagon fight before trying to kill Elden Beast with a bleed-based dagger build wasn't something that sounded particularly enjoyable. So equip Rivers of Blood along with the Flame Shrouding Tear at the Grace. Remove your chest armour for a light roll. No changes to my original guide for Radagon. The flame damage from rivers makes this a far more bearable fight. And the usual strategy for Elden Beast. I went with Millicent's Talisman and R1s for this, but you could easily swap that to the Axe Talisman and Charges if you'd prefer. Unnerfed Bloodhound Step was my previous solution to Elden Stars. However, since the nerf, I just go with a light load and use light rolls wherever I can. The biggest lesson that I've learned fighting Elden Beast time and time again is to try not to let Elden Stars distract you from what he's doing. Whilst Elden Stars is scary, it's far better to tank some of it in order to avoid what he throws at you. Elden Stars can make you panic, and in an effort to avoid its relatively low damage, you jump right in front of one of his high damage attacks, as I do here, which I obviously did intentionally to demonstrate this. And finally, back to the Halig tree for the ultimate parry challenge. The fight that took me 12 hours to do on this build for the first time, although I was level 80 rather than 120 in that guide. And despite that video being 20 minutes long, there were some things that I missed, like the starting attack and this stab attack both being parryable. But the biggest change since that guide is Waterfowl now being dodgeable with a light roll. 3 rolls back when she starts it, and then 3 rolls to dodge the rest. 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 6 o'clock. This is a far better option than Bloodhound Step, it's much simpler. The turtle shield method still works great for any build that can't light roll. And I found it quite fitting that on the last guide of the year, with the first build that I ever beat her solo on, that this was the first time I beat Melania on my first attempt. And that's it. How to beat Elden Ring by parrying everything. In April this year, I started this channel with a very nerdy and badly edited video on some parry tools. To everyone who has watched my videos and given me support, encouragement, and helped me get to nearly 14,000 subscribers since, thank you. I'll be back next year, getting through the massive list of other builds that I want to try. Please do keep giving me your suggestions for this. I will get to everything eventually. Until then, as always, thanks for watching. Merry Christmas. See you next year.